Bans in Magic the Gathering often confuse newer players to the game. They're puzzled by the concept of a magic ban and often wonder why they need to happen. R&D needs to strike a delicate balance in making new cards powerful enough to want to play with and sell new sets, but not so strong that they completely overpower the other cards that go in that card slot. While sometimes R&D gets the power level right, they can also miss a glaring issue with the card, like when they printed Felidar Guardian into a format with Saheeli Rai. This produced a basically format warping combo that frustrated players to the point of some even leaving the game. The same thing happened in 2004 in Mirrored and Block Standard when Affinity was going on a rampage due to too much support and not enough hate and basically couldn't be stopped. To correct these errors, WotC needs to ban some cards after their release to keep the game fun and healthy. This brings us to the format of Modern. This specific format has a deep enough card pool that it can easily break new cards without WotC realizing it, while also not having the powerful old interaction spells like Force of Will because WotC didn't realize how good free cards were in 1996. Well, I guess they still don't today. But to my point, Modern actually has more cards banned per average at a whopping 0.0029% of possible cards being banned, while Legacy is a close second at 0.0028. So, this brings me to the Modern ban list. I know you'll know some oddities about the ban list, like the card Wild Nacatl being banned for 2 years and 3 months, and Stoneforge Mystic being banned a lot longer than it should have. But do you know how the original ban list was created and all the steps along the way to get it to where it is today? If not, feel free to join me as I deep dive the entire history of the Modern ban list. Modern as a format was created in August of 2011. It was originally meant to be a bridge between Standard and Legacy, only using cards in the Modern card frame, that being from 8th edition onwards. As always, when new formats are created, there needs to be a ban list put in place to ensure that there aren't decks that are too overpowered. Right from the start, Wizards of the Coast cited that they aren't okay with some types of combo decks. In the first ban announcement, they said, "We have a rule of thumb about Legacy that we don't like, consistent turn 2 combination decks, but that turn 3 combination decks are okay. We modified that rule for Modern by adding a turn to each side. We're going to allow turn 4 combination decks, but not decks that consistently win the game on turn 3. This established a baseline for what cards they need to ban, although this criteria would change as the years go by. Now, that quote was ripped right from the first Modern ban announcement, but how did they decide what to ban? If you're a relatively newer player, you may not have heard the term Magic Online Community Cup. Hey, I hadn't heard about it until I started doing research for this video. The 2011 Community Cup was changed to this brand new format called Modern. I was lucky enough to speak with two competitors of the Community Cup of 2011, George F. Ellis and Graham Stark, to get their perspectives on the event, as well as to help explain what the event was.
Community Cup was a Wizards of the Coast hosted private tournament that was targeted at community members who wrote articles or did podcasts or were part of their now defunct message boards. It was for people who are now, kind of like Twitter personalities now. They had Luis Scott Vargas and Bing Luke, who was a pretty consistent player back in 2011, I think, or 2010. When he was invited. He was like a proto streamer. They basically said, "Hey guys, here's this format. Here's where it starts. Make the most busted decks you can. We're going to use this as a ban list if this seems popular, and we're going to do it at Pro Tour Philadelphia in a couple of months." And so basically Bing Luke and LSV sat there and built 8 disgusting decks that put a bunch of cards on the ban list.
They told us at some point prior to the event that we would be playing a format called Modern that was brand new. It was sort of like at the time it was looked as a sort of a newer extended kind of thing, and that there was a ban list already in place and we'd have to just make some decks.
So, the Community Cup was basically a 16-player tournament with 8 community members on one side and 8 WotC staff on the other, and they played a tournament. If the community won, the entire community would get some sweet prize on Moto, but if the WotC staff won, they got something like a copy of Darksteel Relic.
The Community Cup overall was always a fun thing for people in the community to cheer for. Wizards were always the bad guys in this. I mean, it was unavoidable to be presented that way, that the community is always going to cheer for the community team. And so it was great that we got to not only go to Wizards and fight them at Magic the Gathering, but also that we emerged victorious from the weekend. But the Community Cup was always a fun, just sort of rallying point, this exhibition of just sort of fun, no real stakes Magic. This particular one was really interesting because it was the first Modern tournament outside of testing. You know, the first actual time that Modern was played with people who didn't work at Wizards of the Coast, you know, and it was really cool to get to be a part of that.
However, the important part of this specific tournament is that the tournament essentially created the first Modern ban list. The ban list going into this tournament was rather conservative and was pretty much only composed of cards that were a huge issue on previous standard seasons. Every single card on this list minus one is still banned to this day.
The interesting thing was that event was also unified constructed. So what that meant was that we could have 4 copies of Jace the Mind Sculptor, but only among the 8 decks that we were putting together. So, you know, one deck could have all 4, or we could have 2 in a deck and 2 in a different deck. So the unified aspect made it pretty interesting.
About the Community Cup, you'll notice that right off the bat, both teams started off with an Elves deck and a Hypergenesis deck. The Elf deck was meant to cast a Glimpse of Nature and then cheat together a bunch of cheap elves while tapping them via Heritage Druid to make a ton of mana, keep drawing through your deck with Regal Force, and then eventually cast an Emrakul with all the mana you have. You also have insanely powerful tutors like Green Sun Zenith and Summoner's Pact to help you find your key elves. This is similar to the Elves decks in current day Legacy. The Hypergenesis deck was meant to find either Violent Outburst, Ardent Plea, or Demonic Dread and cast it. It would cascade into a Hypergenesis because it has the CMC of 0 and you have no other cards that cost 1 or 2 mana in your deck. From there, you can drop a game-ending creature like Emrakul, Terastodon, or Progenitus. Besides those 2 decks, both sides had pretty unique decks. Yeah, sure, both sides had a Jund deck, but besides those, it was a healthy mix of combo, aggro, and control on both sides. I'll leave a link in the description where you can check the full deck list out. By the end of the tournament, there were 9 more cards added to the ban list, and a whopping 11 out of 16 decks had a card banned out from them. Let's go over the bans, shall we? Glimpse of Nature and Hypergenesis were banned because they make those combo decks work, and those decks go against the Modern turn 4 rule, Watsy stated earlier. They also banned Dread Return from the same reason. They banned Stoneforge Mystic, Bitter Blossom, and Jace the Mind Sculptor because they were all powerhouses in Standard, and Watsy thought they would do the same thing in Modern. Valakut the Molten Pinnacle was banned because they thought it would be too strong of a deck, even though it didn't break the turn 4 rule. The final 2 cards they banned were Ancestral Vision and Mental Misstep because they were both seeing heavy Legacy play, and Watsy thought they would be too good in Modern. Finally, with those bans set in place, Modern's 21 card initial ban list was released, and the format of Modern was set loose into the community. However, Watsy would be monitoring Modern very closely to see if any decks would break the format in half, which brings us to September of 2011. About 1 month after Modern was let loose to the public, there was another swath of bannings. Fun fact, this was the announcement that unrestricted Fact or Fiction and Vintage, but that's a story for another day entirely. This announcement contained 6 more additions to the Modern ban list. Blazing Shoal was banned because you could exile something like Greater Gargadon or Myosion of Infinite Rage to one-shot people with an infect creature. Rite of Flame, Preordain, and Ponder were banned because they supported quick combo kills by giving you mana too quickly and by finding the pieces too consistently. Cloudpost was banned because it was Tron on steroids. The last card banned was Green Sun Zenith. They say this was banned because it was a Llanowar Elf on turn 1 fetching a Dryad Arbor, while simultaneously being able to fetch up a Primeval Titan in the late game, and any number of stacks pieces like Gaddock Teeg at any point in between. It was basically never a bad draw. Watsy also stated that there was an element of increasing diversity among Modern green decks. This is a precedent they set here that even if a deck wasn't the most powerful, if it took up too big of a share in the metagame, then it could be considered for a ban. 3 months later, there was yet another ban announcement. This time only 2 cards were banned. The first is Punishing Fire. While not that great by itself, the real combo is with Grove of the Burn Willows. This lets a player essentially ping an opponent for 3 mana, as well as keep any X2s off the field essentially forever. The second ban is a Roller Coaster, so stay with me. Watsy also decided to ban the card Wild Mikado. Yeah, sure, this was a 1 mana 3/3, but it was also just that. That would be like if Watsy banned Tarmogoyf today, just an efficient beater. However, they claim that this was in the name of diversity. After saying that Zoo is basically the dominant aggressive strategy, they say, this creature is so efficient it is keeping too many other creature decks from being competitive. That's that diversity phrase again. You'll notice that the word will quickly become a recurring phrase in the ban announcements. After this first wave of bans, they started to slow down. The next ban announcement being 9 months from then, and this time it was an unban. They unbanned Valakut the Molten Pinnacle. This wasn't really prompted by anything. They pretty much just said, we feel like unbanning a card to see what happens, so let's choose the least risky card that doesn't slot into a ton of decks, so they chose Valakut. About 4 months later, there was another announcement. This time there were 2 cards banned. By this time, a solid blue-red Storm deck was starting to show up that put out consistent turn 3 wins, even without Preordain, Ponder, and Rite of Flame, so Watsy hit the best ritual in the deck, Seething Song. They also hit Bloodbraid Elf. The claim here was once again competitive diversity. They said that Jund was by far the most popular deck and wanted to hit a card from it to weaken it slightly, but it would still be playable. They also wanted a card that was played consistently as a 4-of, but that didn't really show up in many other decks. Thus, Blood Red Elf was the choice here. 5 months later, there was once again another ban announcement. This time it was only one card, and that one card was Second Sunrise. This ban wasn't due to the fact that the deck was so powerful, it more had to do with the time it takes to play the deck eggs. These turns could sometimes take upwards of 15 minutes, occasionally in the overtime of a Grand Prix. The ban of Second Sunrise was pretty much just a ban out of annoyance for how atrocious this deck made tournament Magic. The next ban announcement came 9 months later. This time there was one ban and 2 unbans. Deathray Charmember was banned because the card is just a stupidly powerful 1-mana planeswalker that is relevant at all stages of the game, similar to Green Sun Zenith. Meanwhile, Wild Nacatl was finally taken off the ban list after an agonizing 2 years and 3 months. Ironically, the reason they used to ban the cat in the first reason was the same reason they used to unban it: diversity. Walty said that at the point, artifact aggro strategies like Affinity were at the top, so supposedly bringing back Wild Nacatl should make Zoo aggro a viable option again. The other unban was Bitter Blossom. Walty originally banned it because they were scared of Fairies dominating Modern like it did Standard, and they felt at this time it was probably fine to let Bitter Blossom loose. In September of 2014, Khans of Tarkir was released, and one of the main characteristics in this set was that each of the 5 Khans of Tarkir had a mechanic associated with them. The mechanic of Sultai was Delve. It had appeared on 3 cards in Future Sight, but that's about it. 2 cards with Delve on them have proven to be so strong for Modern that they had to be banned: Dig Through Time and Treasure Cruise. In older formats with a more accessible card pool, you can fill the graveyard very quickly by using cards like Thought Scour and Fetch Lands, and once you do that, Treasure Cruise becomes basically Ancestral Recall. Dig Through Time is similar, way too much card selection for essentially 2 mana when you can fill your graveyard. Those 2 Delve cards went on to be both banned in Legacy and restricted in Vintage. Yeah, turns out cheap card draw spells are pretty good. The other card they banned is Birthing Pod. The argument for the pod was, once again, competitive diversity. Walty theorizes that because pod is so good, it suppresses other creature decks. They cite the newly printed creature Siege Rhino as an example of creatures getting better and better, and as creatures got better, pod would get better with them. There was also one unban, Golgari Grave Troll. Up until that point, there had never been an official Dredge deck that consistently put up results, so Walty unbanned the Grave Troll to try to get that ball rolling. The next ban announcement happened a year later, and it's high up on the list of the most controversial ban announcements. In January of 2016, Walty banned 2 more cards, the first one being Summer Blue. They were at odds whether to hit Summer Bloom or Amulet of Vigor, the 2 most powerful cards in the deck in question, Amulet Blue. They think that banning either one would be sufficient, and that they do recognize Azusa still exists, but they say it is less efficient, so while there is a deck to play, it won't have frequent turn 3 wins. Well, we all know that isn't true. The second ban they made was perhaps one of the most controversial in modern history. They decided to ban the card Splinter Twin. The reasoning can basically be summed up in the last sentence of the article. In the interest of competitive diversity, Splinter Twin is banned in Modern. Let's stop here. I want to take a second to examine banning to create diversity in the Modern format. At this point, there have been 5 different cards banned for the main purpose of creating diversity, not because they are too powerful. Well, sure, you could argue that for a certain deck to become so popular it has to pass the threshold of power, sometimes that isn't true. Look at when they banned Wild Nacatl, for example. Remember the reasoning that they unbanned Wild Nacatl on? How artifact aggro decks were the new best aggressive deck, so they wanted to try to bring Zoo back? Well, here's an affinity list from the very first Modern Pro Tour, 2011, the year Wild Nacatl was banned. And here's an affinity list from July of 2014, roughly 5 months after Wild Nacatl was unbanned. Besides the fact that these 2 are basically the same list, only one has the Fling Atoll combo and the other doesn't. Even more than that, besides a couple of sideboard cards, this exact deck could be built in 2011, the year that Zoo was supposedly dominating, and now it's a top tier deck, arguably better than Zoo in 2014. Even more, according to Bob Huang's modern metagame analysis put out in January of 2014, out of all the top finishing decks, Affinity was 8.8% of the metagame and Zoo was 6.3% of the metagame. Keep in mind that 2% of the metagame is considered to be a top tier deck. With that in mind, given that they're both reasonably close in percentage share and they are both crushing the 2% number, if you unban Wild Nacatl, shouldn't Zoo catapult in front of Affinity? It wasn't like Zoo was 1% and Affinity was 10%, they're reasonably close in metagame percentage. I'm not the only person who thinks this.
The thing that I don't agree with came a few years down the line when they banned cards to create diversity, to sell packs or to shake up the Modern format. Things like Splinter Twin and Birthing Pod. I was an aspiring Modern player and I spent a good amount of time building a Splinter Twin deck. And then it was banned for no reason at all, and I stopped playing Modern. I'm sure people, say that a lot, like, oh, Who would have done that? I am the person that this affected. Someone who has played Magic since 1996. They banned the Splinter Twin for what I feel is no reason, and I quit competitive Magic.
So anyways, Splinter Twin was banned. However, just a week after the Splinter Twin ban was announced, Oath of the Gatewatch came out, and we all know what came with that set. When Oath of the Gatewatch was released, it came with a bunch of new Eldrazi, and not just the big 10-mana Titans, although it did come with that. It also came with a bunch of smaller Eldrazi that was still very powerful. Back in World Wake, Eye of Ugin was printed. This reduced all of your Eldrazi by 2 mana. While that isn't that big of a deal when the smallest Eldrazi in the set was 8 mana, well, technically 7, but whatever. When very powerful and impactful Eldrazi are set at 3, 4, and 5 mana, as well as there being a soul land for that deck, this deck was going to turn out to become a problem. Often the best draw was turn 1 Eye of Ugin, as many Eldrazi mimics as you have. Turn 2 Urborg, Wasteland Strangler, Wasteland Strangler. Pro Tour Oath of the Gatewatch saw 6 of these top 8 decks being Eldrazi decks. In April of 2016, WotC banned Eye of Ugin because Eldrazi was the most powerful deck in the format bar none. They also unbanned a couple of cards. The first one was Ancestral Vision. This was unbanned because the type of deck that wants Ancestral Vision, control decks, weren't very popular in the metagame at that point. They also unbanned Sword of the Meek because they wanted an increase in controlling combo decks. Believe it or not, they also said, it could be used as an alternate win condition in Lantern Control, which is powerful when unexpected, but not currently a large part of the metagame. You heard me right. WotC was trying to buff Lantern Control, aka the most miserable deck to play against of all time. The next ban announcement was in January of 2017. This announcement put 2 more cards on the ban list. The first was Golgari Gravetroll. Between the 2-year period of January 2015 and January 2017, 2 very important cards were printed, Prized Amalgam and Cathartic Reunion. Those 2 cards pushed the Dredge deck over the edge, and as a result, WotC had to ban the largest Dredge card in the game. That makes Golgari Gravetroll the first and only card to ever be unbanned and then rebanned. The second card was Gitaxian Probe. This decision was made mainly due to Death's Shadow decks, where the life loss was welcome. On top of that, it basically gave the Shadow decks a 52 card deck in conjunction with Street Wraith. Free spells are something you should basically always keep an eye on, and in this case, the card was way too good to leave in the modern format. There wasn't another ban announcement for over a year, the longest period without a banning, but today there still wouldn't be a banning. In fact, there was a pair of unbannings. The first one was Bloodbraid Elf. The decision to unban cites diversity once again. They say that there are enough GBX mid-range variants that Jund isn't the go-to anymore. There's Abzan with Lingering Souls and Stony Silence, Jund with Lightning Bolt and Kolaghan's Command, and there could even be Sultai with the second card unbanned today, Jace the Mind Sculptor. They unbanned Jace basically because they agreed a 4-mana card you have to tap out for has to be very good in order for it to be playable, and Jace wasn't significantly better than the other cards in the slot at that point. This was also the first time they had to consider price as a factor when unbanning a card. When the announcement came out, Jace nearly doubled in price, going all the way up to $140. They made a point to unban Jace near a reprinting of his in Masters 25, so hopefully the price would go down. The next ban took place in January 2019 when they banned Krark Clan Ironworks. This was the centerpiece behind a very powerful combo deck. In the ban announcement, they pointed out that they were considering 3 cards for this ban: the Ironworks itself, Ancient Stirrings, and Mox Opal. They were basically saying that instead of banning the enablers to the deck, they banned the centerpiece to get rid of it outright. Banning either of the other 2 would affect other decks, which WotC clearly didn't want. While some people were upset that Mox Opal didn't get banned, many were just happy that the deck was gone. In June of 2019, Modern Horizons was released. This was a set that would completely bypass Standard and go straight into Modern and all the other formats. This let WotC print cards with a higher power level, as they would skip Standard altogether. Inside this set were 2 very important cards. Hogaak Arisen Acropolis was the first one, we'll discuss the other one later. However, people soon found out ways to power out Hogaak really fast, sometimes as quickly as turn 2 using cards like Gravecrawler, Stitcher Supplier, and Carrion Feeder. You could also use the newly brought into Modern Altar of Dementia in conjunction with Bridge from Below and Hogaak to essentially put your entire library in your graveyard and then mill out your opponent with all the 2/2 zombies. When July 2019 came around, WotC didn't ban Hogaak because they didn't want to make it look like a card that they printed in a just for Modern set was too busted for Modern. They banned Bridge from Below instead. However, it just wasn't enough. New Hogaak Vengevine decks dominated Modern for the entirety of June and August, picking up newcomer Sato Wayfinder to replace Bridge from Below. While sure, it wasn't as good as it used to be, it was still wildly better than any other deck at the time. This period of time was nicknamed Hogaak Summer for Hogaak's sheer dominance. On August 26, 2019, they finally ended Hogaak Summer by killing Hogaak itself, but that wasn't the only announcement. They also banned Faithless Looting, which had been turboing our Arclight Phoenixes and Dredge cards for a while now. WotC also feared that some kind of faithless looting deck would become the best deck after Hogaak was gone. They made one final change, and one that was a long time coming. They unbanned Stoneforge Mystic, a card that had been on Modern's initial ban list since the format was released to the public. Their theory was the same with Jace the Mind Sculptor. Now the Modern format is at an appropriate power level for Stoneforge, so it wouldn't completely overpower the field. They really pushed for focus to go away from graveyards, as you can tell with these choices. In October of 2019, Throne of Eldraine was released, and the star of the show, Oko Thief of Crowns, was causing problems in so many formats it's hard to count. After it was banned in Standard, Pioneer, Brawl, and suspended in Historic, it was time to decide whether it should go in Modern too. The most powerful deck at the time was a blue-green artifact mid-range deck, using Oko and the other busted card from Modern Horizons, Urza Lord High Artificer. Oko was present in basically every top deck, and decks were making adjustments just to include the guy. When the ban announcement finally came, to nobody's surprise, they mentioned deck diversity. They also banned Mox Opal in the announcement. They basically said that the card was too good and the restriction wasn't high enough, so that it was gone. It had also been on the watch list since KCI's banning about a year ago, so that makes some amount of sense. They also banned a third card, Mycosynth Lattice, which was completely out of left field for a lot of people. The main interaction with this card was Karn the Great Creator, and WotC thought that Tron decks would become too dominant after Mox Opal's banning, so as some safety precautions, they banned the Lattice too. The most recent Modern banning held just one card, Once Upon a Time. This was mainly due to, you guessed it, deck diversity and free spells being too good. Some decks like Eldrazi Tron would splash green just to include the thing. Man, Modern's ban list sure has interesting, don't you think? From all the way in the Community Cup in 2011 to banning Once Upon a Time in March 2020, it sure has been a wild ride exploring it, and I hope you guys all enjoyed it with me. Any thoughts specific on any bans? I'll also be leaving a quick sheet down below in the description with all of the bans in chronological order as well as all the announcements that WotC made, so you can go check the reasoning for yourself. Also, huge thank you to Graham Stark and Georgia Fellas for letting me interview them on this topic. Their social will be in the description down below, as well as mine. Twitter, Twitch, TCG Player Affiliate, all in the description as well. If you like the content, be sure to sub to the channel and leave a like as well. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.